When thinking about this year's Houston Cougar football season, I think everyone's got one question in mind. Jim Moore said it best. Playoffs?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making the Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. We should make your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. If you want to join the conversation and don't know what to say, go ahead, hear me be critical of the Jim Moore impression. Let it fly. I can take it. Today's show is brought to you by our buddies over at FanDuel, America's number one sports. We got more on that fun later. Houston is favored 13.5 points presently on FanDuel. Get in on the action over there. I want to talk about the idea of making the playoff this year at 11 wins, kind of big picture what that looks like. Don't want to get too big for our britches yet, but do want to think about some things with that. Second segment, there's been some rumors on Willie Fritz continue to swirl at a very low pace for some SEC jobs. I don't think there's anything to that. We'll talk about that in the second segment. And third, final segment, injury player availability report comes out at 9 o'clock local time on Wednesday night. And that came out. And of course, we've got some stuff to bring up there because there's always going to be a few problems. But first, the playoffs. Now, look, in this discussion, we do understand Houston's got to win the rest of their games for any of this to matter, right? At 11 wins, you really are talking about a college football playoff and potential. And frankly, that's kind of the crux of the conversation I think is worth having here is does 11 wins get you in, right? Yes. If they overlook one of their next four opponents where Houston would probably be favored in all games, they theoretically would be knocking themselves out, stumbling over their own, all that kind of, yes, obviously. However, in talking through things this week, I think it continues to be an interesting conversation as to, well, if they win out and get to that 11 win mark, is that enough? Now, I think there's a few scenarios in which this works. One, you get to 11 wins, you go to the conference championship game, and you win the whole thing, you get a 12th win, then you're definitely in, right? I think that writes itself. You have to be a Big 12 champion. There's a Power 4 conference champion. You're in. You might be a lower seed than other programs might be. You might be, the underdog in that theoretical playoff matchup, whatever. But if you win the Big 12 conference, you're going to be in, especially if you win the Big 12 conference at 11 or 12 wins. Other options there would be if you got to that conference title game with 11 wins and then somehow lost it, right? Would you be able to pull what SMU did in the college football playoff last year and still backdoor your way in? I don't think that's going to necessarily happen. I worry actually the more likely option actually would be that the third option out of Tech, BYU, and Houston would get in because Tech and BYU have been flirting with playoff rankings throughout the entire year. And so ultimately, they would see this as some way to get those two teams in and not Houston. Now, I do think that it's interesting because then in an 11-win season where you're not in the Big 12 title game, you got win 11 games, but on some tiebreaker, they put in BYU and Tech or BYU and Cincinnati or whatever. Then you theoretically, I don't know if you get in or not in that case. If you're not in and you're just an 11-win team, then suddenly, right, it's all done. And I think what's fascinating about this is it feels like it's very much a brands conversation. And I say that because it's ironic to be talking about Houston as a brand in a negative light, bringing onto campus this weekend the anniversary 2015 Peach Bowl champion team, right? That was a program, or a point in the program where even in the group of five, you were kind of getting to expect like Houston was going to have a single digit, not just a ranking, but a single digit one next to their name for parts of the year, if not large stretches of the year, right? It was disappointing, frankly, when you lost in those seasons, right? And so you're looking at like, okay, well, what's the difference between branding then and branding now? The sport has changed, but if anything, you've moved into the Big 12. Shouldn't that carry some more weight? That may speak to some of the damage done in the interim, but I would also think that there is something to be said about like this branding thing feels more like outside looking in, because I don't know what else. Anyway, when Houston wins 11 games, I would say it wins 11 games. That's when it gets to like the strength of schedule. And per ESPN, Houston has the 80th ranked schedule in terms of difficulty in college football. For reference, Duke is 79th, Kennesaw State is 81st. Houston is ahead of Big 12 comrade Cincinnati at 86, but Houston at 80 and Cincinnati at 86 are the two worst in the Big 12. And it's worth pointing out that Cincinnati is at 86, having also played Nebraska in week 1. I would also point out that Georgia Tech is 82nd, and they're undefeated in the top 10 presently in the AP poll. And that may be something to do with like carrying over from last year's almost win against Georgia. That seems to propel this year's entire Georgia Tech storyline. Whatever. I would also say that Texas Tech is so much better playing at the 60th ranked schedule, right? Which is higher, yes, but not like in the top 10 schedules or something like that, right? I would also, and I point this out every time it comes up, strength schedule is admittedly swung by AP poll rankings and the biases that will come with those. So when we talk about like biases and a lot of SEC schools getting unnecessary favoritism or getting written off. Oh, that second loss isn't. Oh, that third loss isn't so bad. Or whatever's like happening to UT Austin or whatever. Those kinds of biases play into strength of schedule too, because playing ranked opponents impacts your strength of schedule. Right. That is all to say that this branding and this Houston at 11 wins need to still win the Big 12 conference to get into the college football playoff and all that. While I admit that it may feel far-fetched in this moment, it does feel like it's just a branding historical bias issue. Texas and Oklahoma left the Big 12 in 2020 after the 2023 football season, but had either one of those schools been playing the Big 12 this year and had the exact same schedule as Houston and the exact same resume as Houston, a at the time top 10 loss to Texas Tech, or I guess it was shortly thereafter, a top 10 loss to Texas Tech with their healthy quarterback, where your own quarterback went out in the second quarter, and you're undefeated across the rest of your games, going to 11-1 on the schedule. Most people would put Texas or Oklahoma with the exact same resume, exact same opponents, exact same results in. They would say that the Oregon State win was gritty and, good teams find ways to win those games or whatever. They'd point to the Arizona State game as a sign of growth from those other opportunities. They'd look at Stephen F. Austin and Rice, like you beat them like you're supposed to, right? Those kinds of things would all be talked about if this were a different program, if the logos on the shirts were just a little different. And I think that ultimately that's what makes some of this bias all play out in a way that feels very nonsensical, right? So when you talk about like, should the college football playoff get extended or expand or whatever, if it would help negate some of those biases, maybe if there's some way to make sure every power conference gets 3 AQs or whatever, then maybe, right? Because you're trying to help limit some of those biases that play out in this. That all being said, I can already see the folks. I can see you typing on your keyboard that this should not matter. We're too far ahead of the game. Like, let's just win the games while they're in front of us. And it's just year 2 of the Willie Fritz rebuild and getting way, way too out in front of your skis on this one, Parker. And I get that, but we also see, as I mentioned, Georgia Tech schedule is no more difficult than Houston's thus far. They do end the year with Georgia. It'll change a little bit then. But to this point, Georgia Tech's schedule is not anymore. It's actually less difficult than Houston's. Georgia Tech is undefeated, so they have one less win or one less loss, one whole less loss, right, thus far. And again, I would mention the schedule's easier. Georgia Tech is in the top 10 in the AP poll and would project to be in a college football playoff, and frankly, could maybe stand to lose to Miami in an ACC championship game and still get in because of how highly ranked they've been all season. And I think that still propels itself from such an impressive performance last year. They almost beat Georgia, who was very good a year ago. And while the SEC wants to coattail ride on a couple of good programs every year, I would say that Georgia was pretty good last year. It's been pretty good since the last 5-6 years, right? And probably longer, but you hear me out on that, right? These things stack up year to year. Your brand gets built over the course of years. And Houston getting disrespected this year means A, you probably need to go out and win whatever bowl game they put you in to prove that next year they need to put you in a better one, right? But B, it's worth noting as we hear people talk about changing these playoff structures and changing these whatevers, because they're showing you what they're going to do to you, right? Now, if Houston were to find some way into the playoff, right? You'd hope for, frankly, if you won the Big 12, you want a 1 through 4 seed for the bye. You get to play in a neutral site in the second week. I think that actually helps Houston in a lot of ways. The nightmare scenario of having to play on the road in the first round, if you're like the 9 through 12 seed, sounds terrifying. I think a road college football playoff game would be terrible. A neutral site's one thing. A road college football playoff game is the top, like, for all the marbles. That sounds rough. I would also point out that there are a number of teams in the running for the college football playoff that would have large city of Houston connections if you were to host a game yourself at the 5 through 8 spot, and that may present its own challenges. How you protect the tickets you're selling from hitting the secondary market and going to those other fans for big paydays would be really hard to do. That's all future problems that we'll admittedly probably tackle when they happen. But as the playoff picture approaches, Houston's weirdly in it. And I didn't want to go too far past that without looking into it. I also want to go too far past some Willie Fritz rumors that just do not seem to go away when it comes to the SEC. And so I want to get into that 1 second. Before we get to that, though, today's show is brought to you by everybody's at FanDuel, because the NBA is back. The World Series is happening. NFL is here. College football is here. Everything, hockey, it's all happening at once. There's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Because even if you've missed the start of the game or you'll ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score in the next to the fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a much bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. Get on the action right now. Head to FanDuel. New customers get $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. So head to FanDuel.com, sign up today, and play your game with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Parker Rangers locked on Coogs here. And I want to admit, shouts to Coug fans, I think, is run by Go Cougs at this point. They're kind of all lumped together. I'm not a gigantic message boards guy. I did get sent this in a texting thread from some folks about this, and I think it's shenanigans. But apparently, the Big 12 Insiders podcast, 24/7 Sports guys, said that Willie Fritz is being linked to Arkansas. This is only a few days after there was rumor that Willie Fritz is being linked to LSU. This feels like these SEC schools that can't get anything right and pay a bunch of coaches to not coach once they get fired really like the idea of hiring a Willie Fritz type guy. But I want to tell you what, Arkansas is not going to happen, and LSU is not going to happen, right? I would point out that the 24/7 guys would admit themselves on the show, as you listen to the clip, that Arkansas would be a huge mistake for Willie Fritz. Sam Pittman, the man they fired earlier this year, was making just about $5 million annually. Willie Fritz has a $4.5 million, both base salaries. Admittedly, the accelerators, I think, are steeper at Arkansas, but that's not a whole lot different. Frankly, I would point out even those accelerators or bonuses might be steeper at Arkansas. You might be more likely to hit them at Houston, given the opponents, the resources, etc. Right now, Arkansas does have access to a lot of resources: the Walton family, the Jerry Jones family, etc. But those donations haven't ever come to fruition in a major way in college football. Frankly, I think Jerry Jones gave like a $10 million donation like sometime in the last decade. That's kind of the last major deal you saw handed over. And that's odd considering how much money they could potentially be tapping into. Further, Houston's got the better locale, better recruiting background, better recruiting your backyard, all that kind of stuff. And for what it's worth, is a program on the up and up. We've seen Houston have folks flock to it in the transfer portal last offseason. We've seen when Houston is the cool thing to do, they can land recruits. Like when you had, Houston H-Town takeover, getting guys like Ed Oliver. When you have Willie Fritz and Fritz Smith, bringing in Keyshawn Henderson, these things build on themselves, right? And so while I think Houston's got the better job than Arkansas for a number of reasons, including, frankly, that his family, Willie Fritz's family, lives in Houston, and he brought his family to Houston for the Power Forward job, but also to be closer to his children that live there, right? I would also point out that Arkansas, with I guess they do make an SEC TV dollar check or whatever, but they owe Sam Pittman over $7.5 million to not coach. Willie Fritz's buyout at the University of Houston at this point would be $19 million. And then let's say they pay him more than they paid that Pittman guy. You're looking very quickly at like what, over 35, close to $35 million to get this to happen. And I don't see Arkansas doing that for a guy that's 65. I love Willie, and I think Willie has proven me every concern I've had about his age wrong at every turn of the corner, right? And I want to give mad props to him for that. However, if you're Arkansas and you're the AD at Arkansas, are you going to sell your donors on a $35 million proposition to bring in a guy at 65? I could tell you how great Coach Willie Fritz is. I don't think the Arkansas average donor is going to think that's worth it. And they're going to say, hey, let's take that $35 million and go get someone who will be here longer. The Arkansas rebuild is going to take more time, right? Now, I also think that it's worth pointing out that he did get linked briefly to the LSU job. And look, the inverse of this, I think, is that of the jobs on the market, and frankly, of the jobs in college football, I will admit, I think LSU probably is one of the top jobs in the sport. Great support in terms of finances, great recruiting background. You get parts of Texas, you get parts of the Deep South. You also get the state of Louisiana, which is not a very big state, but per capita is incredibly talented at recruiting. And it feels like outside of Brian Kelly, every coach that goes there wins a title, right? I think that's a great job in this sport, and I don't want to act like it's not. I'm not going to sit here and try and sell you on something else. Or it's a great job. The reason I don't think that's going to work is frankly twofold. One, in terms of what they want in a coach, LSU has shown time and time again they're much more of the CEO, business owner, make sure that the trains are running on time kind of guy as far as the head coach goes. That's not Willie. Willie's a ball coach, right? Willie is a true ball coach. He is in the culture building process. He is involved with the guys. He's amongst them, so to speak, right? That's not quite. LSU needs a guy that's shaking hands and don't. And while Willie's good at that, he's not the. That's not the thing he does as like his calling card, like an LSU would be looking for, right? So I don't think that that's where they would go with that. I also look at LSU and frankly think they're in too messy a spot to negotiate this right now. The current athletic director is the same athletic director that's negotiated getting Jimbo Fisher his deal at Texas A&M. And so if you put that together, the gigantic Jimbo Fisher buyout and the gigantic Brian Kelly buyout were both negotiated by this kind of half-wit LSU athletic director, right? You've heard the governor of Louisiana say that the current AD will not be picking the next head coach at LSU. Well, if the AD's job is not to hire coaches, you start to question how long the AD is going to be there. And I don't think some new AD is going to want to say, hey, I'm bringing in the guy from Houston and Tulane. Trust me on this one. I get that, right? The same reasons. Right? I think they're going to be looking for a splash, a big name, the Lane Kiffins. Can you bring back Nick Saban? They're going to be looking for those kinds of names. And reality of whether or not I can get them is one thing. That's what they're looking for, right? I don't think that's going to be where Willie Fritz lands either. I don't think Willie Fritz is going anywhere. I think it's just being flattered to be tied to these is fun and all of that. But ultimately, Willie Fritz is going to coach at Houston, and I'd imagine he coaches at Houston throughout this rebuilding process, wins some titles and wins some rings along the way, and then hangs it up and gets to watch his, program he built up continue to be strong. I think that's where you're going to see this really go. I don't think any of these SEC jobs are anything going on. For what it's worth, I don't think Willie Fritz is a Penn State guy or a Florida guy either. If you're asking me who goes where, I kind of think Matt RHULE ends up at Penn State. I kind of think Joe BRADY ends up at LSU. As far as Arkansas goes, I kind of think Rhett Lashley might make some sense as well. And each of those guys you'll note is a very different guy than Willie Fritz. And I think that's kind of why I'm shaping my head around like those guys seem to make more sense for what those programs want. Willie Fritz makes a lot of sense for what Houston wants, and what frankly Willie Fritz wants seems to make a lot of sense for what Houston is, right? And that's a program he can build up in a part of the country he wants to live in a part of the country that's flush with all the resources he wants and cares about. He cares about recruiting grounds. He cares about, he said over and over again, not having to get on a plane to recruit because your backyard is that kind of talented. That's what Willie Fritz wants, right? And that's what Willie Fritz wants to do as well. He wants to be in and amongst the players. He doesn't want to be the CEO and all of that. I just feel like all of this talk is flattering to have your coach wanted by so many, but just kind of random podcasters like this Big 12 Insider Group, whatever. And admittedly, look, this is a clicks economy. I don't mean to act holier than thou. I should probably not say it like that, right? But I think that's all this is. I wouldn't worry about it. I don't know if anyone else should be worried about it. It's conjecture, and that's kind of where I would leave it at. Now, if something, I guess, goes chaotic and more rumors heat up, whatever, I'll let you know. I did DM some people on the Arkansas front that I only know a little bit. Some people, frankly, I talked to when that whole basketball game was coming together, like, hey, what are you hearing on this? And none of them had really put much together on Willie Fritz either, which I think is also fairly telling. But if I hear more, you'll hear more. But I just don't think there's a whole lot going on there. Speaking of a whole lot going on there, I do think there's a whole lot going on in this injury and availability report. And so I want to talk about that a little bit in just 1 second. Before we get too far, today's show is also brought to you by our buddies over at Mazda. Move and be moved, because Mazda crafts cars for those who do more than simply move. Because Mazda delivers confidence every ride, more IIH's top safety pick awards than anyone else after this past year. And I feel like it's worth pointing out. I talk about being a dad of a toddler all the time. I still feel like a new dad every day in a lot of ways. Putting a car seat in a car where it ranks really highly in these top safety pick awards just feels a little bit more makes you feel a little bit more confident, makes you feel a little more calm about the whole process, which can be really stressful. And just like Houston's players, Mazda sweats every single detail, because when you make every move count, impossible can become irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. Parker Rangers locked on Coogs here. And the Houston Cougars take the field this weekend as heavy favorites against the West Virginia Mountaineers. They hope to honor Kurt Hester in as many ways as possible with hashtag Unbreakable and different tributes throughout the game and stadium and all of that on the field, the player, whatever, right? They're wearing all black because that was a favorite of Kurt Hester's. Rest in peace to Kurt Hester after losing his fight with cancer last weekend. Unbreakable as a tagline seems to be the mantra of the program moving forward. And I cannot think of a better way, frankly, to continue to push and fight for the fight in honor of the memory, I should say, of Kurt Hester. As they approach this weekend, Wednesday night, 9 o'clock local time, Big 12 asked teams to report their first set of player availability reports. And Houston and West Virginia came out. This is from the Big 12 page themselves. And you'll notice Houston's page is actually fairly thin. It's one of the lightest lists Houston's had thus far. You also notice when we talked with Paul yesterday about West Virginia side of things, like their side's not very thin. They got a lot of guys out, right? But one that stuck out to me for Houston was not necessarily Stacey Snead being questionable, not the fact that Devin Williams has been on the out list for forever, it feels like, but Jason Queso Brooks being listed as doubtful is worrisome. And I wonder how much plays into this weekend. But Jason Queso Brooks has been one of the more consistent. He's played 7 of the 8 games, so I shouldn't say he played every game, but one of the more consistent options Houston's had on the offensive line. And frankly, he's held down that left guard spot for nearly every snap he's been available to play. And for Houston to be successful, as every week, but specifically this week, they're going to want to establish a run early, often, and with force. And Jason Brooks is very good at that. And this feels like a potential ding in that. Not because necessarily it's not a group effort or anything like that, but they just they're still working through They don't have a lot of options. This was not a group that was deeper than it was a year ago, but not a deep group to say the least, right? And so losing Jason Brooks hurts. And he's doubtful. He's not out. Doubtful, not out, but that's problematic. Now, running the football, I don't need to tell you anything, has been integral to Houston's success. You see guards pulling a lot on these QB power plays that have been integrated into the offense a whole lot. You also see them kind of as the crucial block and cutbacks about the zone replay. So when you're running zone as a running back, you're pressing the front side A gap. And if the defensive tackle tries to cross center's face, you can cut it back. Well, that's cutting off the backside guard, right? If the backside defensive tackle does not try to cross face, then you're actually going off the play side guard and picking one of his. We used to always say which butt cheek you're going to go off of, right? You're picking one side or the other of the guard to go off of, ipso facto on both directions, play side and weak side. The guards are pretty big roles in zone blocking schemes, right? Jason Brooks being out would kind of hurt some, not just the chemistry of having guys you can rely on up there, but would also hurt because he's proven to be the better option at left guard for Houston all year long. Now, I say that to say that another thing is I think that schematically, West Virginia is also hurting when you run the football. West Virginia has been giving up, on average this season, 160 yards per game on the ground. But when they beat Pitt and beat an FCS school, and both of those games, they allowed less than 50 yards. So when you look at just the 6 losses, because they are 2-6, and their 2 wins were again an FCS school and Pitt, they're actually giving up over 175 yards on the ground in those 6 losses. That includes both Kansas and Utah, where they gave up over 240 yards, and Ohio, not Ohio State, the University of Ohio, they gave up over 180 yards. If Houston's going to win this weekend, and I think they will, the the easiest path, most visible path to doing that is going to be doing it on the ground. Now, Stacey Snead being listed as questionable is an improvement, and frankly, 3 weeks ago when he got hurt, we heard a couple days later it'd be a 3 week kind of injury. So we're in the window. We can expect him to maybe be back soon. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation given what we'd heard about that injury. I also know that for what it's worth, the one of the things, like, Fritz is very open about a lot of things. The one thing he does keep pretty tight-lipped as a staff and as a program is the health of his players, both from a like keeping things private and from a schematic kind of advantage to opponents, right? He does keep these things pretty tight-lipped around the program. And so if I got a whole lot of details, going to be honest with you, I probably wouldn't put them out there till they were public anyway, out of respect for the program WILLIE FRITZ building. But also, B, I think that they're being pretty vulnerable in putting Stacey Snead as questionable or Jason Brooks as doubtful. We could clown on Utah, but Kyle Whittingham is not doing that at Utah, right? He's lying through a lot of these things. A lot of the time, they've already been slapped on the wrist and told not to do that a couple times. Now, I would also point out in this short report, you don't have Jamarian Burnett, so maybe you have more running back options there, and maybe Jason Brooks at questionable is available to play, and he actually ends up being a game time kind of decision. He plays the first half, you build up a lead, you pull him, you don't want him to take too many hits or whatever. I've seen, speaking of running game and running the ball down West Virginia throat, enough conversation in our comment section here or whatever about, like, do you really want to continue running the ball down people's throats with your quarterback, Connor Wigman, given the injury history he's had? And to that, I still say yes. I think, frankly, if ifs and buts were fish and nuts, no men would starve. And also, I think that, like, you can't take away what a guy's good at. Yes, the injury prone thing is he's had bad luck in the past, knock on wood, but he's running the ball effectively. He's big, he's strong, he's looking great doing it. And B, like, he's a ball player. He's tough. He's going to run. He's going to be kind of guy that gets in there and QB sneak and finds the extra yards. You can't take away what a guy does well. I also would point out that, like, I said I would point out a couple times. That's probably too many times in an episode. I probably hit the max on that at some point. But quarterback injuries in the run game, I feel like, actually happen more often when a guy is breaking out to scramble or trying to, like, buy extra time in the pocket. And and there's just a bunch of guys chasing around, always running around loose. Designed run plays when you're running the football and you have more of a intentionality behind your pads and all that kind of stuff. And frankly, you're like running with a purpose in a different kind of way than you're running to escape things. You see a lot less of those. And now that's not to say it can't happen. I just don't think that I'm changing the offense up dramatically from what's been working for the majority of the last, whatever that is, 4 or 5 games, just to be cautious. The point is to win the games, and you don't want to not do what you do well in an effort to do that. Now, I want to bring West Virginia one last breakdown tomorrow. So hit subscribe at the bell so you know we go live for those kinds of things. Also, there were obviously big basketball recruits last weekend. Basketball season officially opens up on Monday for the men's program. Like lots of that in the air. So hit subscribe because we're going to be pushing out some of that kind of content as well. If recruits commit, we'll be ready to go and talk about it right away. You're going to hit Locked On Coogs wherever you get your podcasts each and every day. For a second listen, though, go to Locked On Big 12. Big 12 Squad Show comes out later, so make sure you check that out. Locked On Coogs is a prime member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.